everybody. Welcome to the next day of Connections. I had mentioned yesterday one of the real pleasures I have in doing Connections is the caliber of people I get to introduce. And I think I've been never quite so pleased as the person that I'm introducing right now. Dr. Phil Sabin was one of the very first international participants in the Connections Conference, and he is now the first non-U.S. recipient of the coveted Connections Lifetime Achievement Award. That those of you who are new to Connections are probably a little bit confused by this. The very first person to achieve a Lifetime Achievement Award was Dr. Peter Perla, quite appropriately. And the trophy was going to be delivered and and a person stayed at their home to get it and drove, and it never showed up. We had nothing, so out of desperation, I passed the snack table and grabbed a banana just so I could have something to give to Peter. And since then, the presentation has always been a banana. The Tim Wilkie tells me that he and Scott are working on, more boring trophies to give the three of us. But we are going to keep the tradition of always making the presentation with a banana. And very well deserved. A lifetime achievement is for a lifetime achievement, and many people have attested to Phil's deservingness of this. He's part of the Gang of Four: Colin Maston, Tom Mowat, Graham Langley Brown, who put together the first Connections UK, the first non-US Connections, and that really made the rest of them possible. Graham has said that without Phil, Connections UK would not be what it is today. It would very probably not exist at all. Tom Mowat said that he was there at the inception of the Wargaming Handbook, Wargaming Doctrine. Something about running up and down 7 flights of stairs, didn't quite catch that. Colin Maston talked about the impact that Phil has had at King's and through the British military more broadly. And one of his former students, Ivanka, I'm not even going to try, Ivanka B+8, has said that teaching his conflict simulation course since 2003, he has had a global impact both directly and through all of his students. John Curry, the guy who runs the Wargaming History Project that you'll hear from shortly, talked about that Phil's the face of academic wargaming in the United Kingdom, and has really been the single person most responsible for making wargaming an established tool within the not only the British military, but the British government. Maybe the best is from Peter Perla, where he talks about how Phil is such a dominant force in wargaming historical and scholarship, historical and contemporary, conflict and competition. His books, Lost Battles and Simulating War, are seminal in the field. That his impact in King's College and Continental is unmatched. His influence extends throughout the world and really achieves the highest aspirations of Connections that the Connections he has personally did. And I am personally very proud to count him as a friend and a colleague. My wargaming is better because of him. I am a better person because of him. And I know no one who is more deserving of this banana than Phil Sabin. Phil, thank you so much for talking today. Thank you so much for all you've done over all these years. You're on.
Okay, thank you very much. As usual, Matt, the fulsome praise, and the banana is very much appreciated, even though I won't be able to eat it, and I'm not sure how it would look preserved. But anyway, thank you for that wonderful introduction. This is my second talk at Connections. I've never been able to visit in person. I gave a virtual talk before when everybody else was in the room, as it were, and that was a little disconcerting. Now everybody's at the same level, so that's fine, and the technology is obviously rather better than it was then. I won't inflict death by PowerPoint on you. We've had plenty of that, quite rightly, in other presentations. I'm also not going to give you the opportunity of guessing which part of my head's going to disappear into the virtual background. So in that sense, we'll rely on older technology. I want to talk about something that's already been mentioned in the conference, namely WATU and its relationship to wargaming today. Wargame proponents often are asked to cite examples which show that wargaming can make a cost-effective contribution to defense planning. And appropriately for CNA's sponsorship of this conference, the response is often to appeal to past examples of naval wargaming, the many games run by the US Naval War College in the interwar years, for example. But perhaps the most single most common historical example cited is the manifold success of the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, WATU, in helping to overcome the U-boat threat during World War II. Its achievement has been rightly highlighted recently by those much more expert than myself, Paul Strong in his talk at Connections UK in 2017, Simon Parkin in his recent book, A Game of Birds and Wolves. John Curry reminded me of the many dimensions of WATU's work, ranging from training to operational analysis, from tactics to strategy, and playing a key role not only in winning the Battle of the Atlantic, but also in protecting vessels during the Normandy invasion. WATU is also an obvious precedent to trumpet today, because it's one of all too few examples in the history of wargaming in which women played a deservedly prominent role, with Wrens often proving the most effective virtual escort commanders. Yesterday it was summed up as girls beat subs. With women today making ever more important and equal contributions to professional wargaming, WATU shows how overdue are the Derby House principles of inclusion and diversity, championed by PACSIMS and endorsed by a growing majority of wargaming institutions. Though I do have to say, gender balance is an area where Connections has definite room for improvement in years to come. Now, I don't wish to question for a moment the undoubted success of WATU in helping Allied navies overcome the grave challenges they faced from the U-boats nearly 80 years ago. But I do want to suggest that these challenges were very different in character from those we face today, and hence that WATU as a precedent is less and less directly relevant as a guide to how to apply wargaming effectively in today's world. Despite being ahead of its time as regards gender equality, WATU developed techniques which were focused on a very particular kind of tactical and strategic challenge. Some of its outstanding success arose from the fact that it faced what was, in hindsight, a relatively easy set of problems to wargame. So the WATU example doesn't provide quite as strong a case as we might wish that wargaming works as a generic methodology, nor does it necessarily provide the best specific template for how to wargame effectively in the modern world. I'll discuss later what forms of wargaming are most appropriate today, with particular reference to the growing potential of AI. But first, let me identify several ways in which WATU's challenges were distinctive and increasingly unrepresentative. For one thing, the maritime environment, though far from simple with its variable weather, depth, signal propagation, and so on, is significantly more uniform than the land environment, with its highly diverse natural and human terrain. It also limits armed forces, especially before 1945, to a relatively narrow range of air, surface, and subsurface platforms, weapons, sensors, and communication systems. So it was fairly straightforward for WATU to model the observed physical capabilities of these various systems, such as speeds, turning circles, detection ranges, and the like, and hence create a relatively uncontroversial virtual representation of the real world within which players could contend. I've designed several similar games of historical air and naval combat myself in recent years, and it's a great relief when one doesn't have to make and justify wild assumptions or vague abstractions to underpin one's game mechanics, but can instead fall back on hard data such as loss statistics, trials of comparative performance, and the simple physics which governs the trading of speed for height. 21st century conflict, by contrast, is inherently multi-dimensional, and it involves an ever-increasing range of potential levers which may be utilized in the struggle for advantage, of which conventional weapons are only one. Fake news, hacking, election interference, hostage-taking, sabotage, assassination, corruption, subversion, terrorism, arming proxies, politicizing refugee flows. These are only a few of the other levers we've seen employed in recent years, together, of course, with the endless mutual quest to sanction or exploit increasingly tangled financial, economic, technological, and resource interdependencies for coercive effect. Unlike for Watu, it's a real challenge for modern wargamers even to identify the growing range of potential levers which antagonists might seek to employ, let alone to create an uncontroversial model of their likely impact in a world where individual incidents can have profound and quite possibly counterproductive effects through the capricious spotlight of media amplification. It's rather as if Watu was operating in a fairly predictable and linear Newtonian universe, whereas we are exposed to all the yawning uncertainties of chaos theory. And this leads me to the second big difference with today, namely that Watu was one of the last organizations able to model great power conflict as a total rather than limited phenomenon. In the Atlantic of 1943, both sides were doing everything within their physical and industrial capacity to prevail. But the advent of nuclear weapons made total war senseless, and meant that even conventional clashes between nuclear powers would be dominated at least as much by brinkmanship and fears of escalation as by the traditional calculus of military advantage. Wargamers during the Cold War worked assiduously to tease out the paradoxical logic of nuclear deterrence, and they created ever more elaborate theories of how a limited conventional or even nuclear conflict between East and West might play out. But the actual end of the Cold War occurred in a way which none of these theories had anticipated. In the meantime, both superpowers faced frustration and humiliation in Vietnam and Afghanistan against much less powerful adversaries which didn't even possess nuclear weapons. And the 3 decades since the Cold War have revealed patterns of deterrence, self-restraint, opportunism, and righteous disillusionment more tangled than anything envisaged in the classic earlier theories of limited war. Western states have intervened against adversaries in Iraq, Somalia, former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Libya, Mali, and elsewhere. But all too often, initial military success has gradually turned sour in the face of war weariness and endemic ethnic and religious strife. Russia, meanwhile, despite its weak resource base, has intervened fairly successfully in the Caucasus, Ukraine, Syria, and elsewhere by focusing on areas where it has strong local sympathy. A key tactic, already seen in Kennedy's blockade of Cuba in 1962, has been to leave opponents with little choice except to acquiesce in one's gains or to start a shooting war. This is well illustrated by Russia's bloodless annexation of Crimea and by China's ingenious expansion and fortification of its claimed islets in the South China Sea. Now, although it's entirely possible for wargamers to model potentially high-intensity conventional conflicts in such theaters using techniques rather like those employed by Watu, experience suggests that finding ways to achieve or respond to such real-life fait accompli at a much higher level of restraint is of at least equal importance. I find it very telling that hobby wargamers have not produced that many games on the frustrating and inglorious litany of post-Cold War conflicts, and that these are actually outnumbered by games designed recently on the now entirely imaginary possibility that the original Cold War might have gone hot after all. And this point in turn highlights a third key difference between Watu and wargaming today. Namely, The all-out naval battles played out in Watu were actually happening for real. It was hence possible for Watu's games to be informed and validated constantly by real operational experience, and for participants in the actual convoy battles to take part in the games and provide a crucial reality check to maintain the accuracy of the simulation model. Today, by contrast, it has been decades since a balanced, high-intensity conflict has occurred between evenly matched forces with the latest technology. Even during the Cold War, modeling of a potential clash between East and West depended heavily on extrapolation from sporadic high-technology conflicts elsewhere, such as the Yom Kippur and Falklands Wars. With technological asymmetries in real conflicts, since then becoming so extreme that in Kosovo and Libya, not one attacking jet pilot was lost during the entire air campaigns, wargamers today are uncomfortably dependent on notoriously theoretical weapons performance data when trying to assess what absolute and relative attrition rates might occur should a more evenly matched clash between the complex mix of opposing hardware and software in regions like the Taiwan Straits or the South China Sea develop after all. Now, we do, of course, have all too much experience recently with a different form of conflict, namely prolonged and bloody insurgencies and civil wars within a wide range of states, especially in the Muslim world. Once these conflicts are actually underway, wargamers can observe their dynamics and seek to model them to improve our tactical and strategic responses, just as Watu did during the long campaign against the U-boats. So wargaming has made at least some useful contributions during our long campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's now started to inform our responses to the COVID virus. Now the characteristics of the virus's transmission and the comparative effectiveness and societal cost of different lockdown options are at last becoming clearer. It's much harder for wargames to anticipate in advance such unexpected phenomena as the 9/11 attacks, the collapse of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya into enduring quagmires after our initial apparently successful intervention, the meteoric rise of ISIS, or the way in which COVID so suddenly shattered ways of working and traveling which we'd previously taken for granted. Even if certain wargames do turn out in hindsight to have been remarkably prescient, the chance of them having influenced busy policymakers before the event is demoralizingly small. Wargames also do not reflect well the endless character of so many modern conflicts and policy challenges, since by their nature, they're discrete events with an artificial endpoint. Now, this wasn't such a problem for Watu, since the struggle against Nazi Germany could itself be brought to a victorious conclusion by a few years of energetic campaigning. But in our modern world of Rupert Smith's endless wars among the people, the episodic nature of wargames may reinforce our oft-remarked short-term focus and vulnerability to war weariness in the face of more patient adversaries. The fourth key difference between the problems tackled by Watu and those we face today lies in the relative importance of the human dimension. From the combatant's perspective, modern naval warfare is particularly cruel and uncompromising, since individual sailors cannot save themselves by flight or surrender, as soldiers, pilots, and civilians may be able to do. Watu could hence analyze the Atlantic battles primarily as a clash of technologies, whose dynamics were more readily calculable than in contests shaped more by human strengths and frailties. Now, this doesn't mean that the human dimension, in terms of boldness and tactical skill, especially on the part of the vessel commanders, did not also have a key influence in the combats. The ace factor, which saw a minority of fighter pilots achieve a disproportionate share of kills, applied equally at sea. You see this in the failure of the Germans to increase sinkings in proportion to the massive expansion of their U-boat fleet, once early aces, such as Prien, Kretschmer, and Schepke, were lost. The whole point of Watu was to increase the competence and confidence of the escort commanders through virtual training and tactical experimentation, and so to shift the vital human force multiplier even further in the Allied favor, as increasing U-boat losses created a vicious downward spiral in the experience of Kriegsmarine crews. Exactly the same shifting balance of aircrew competence eventually decided the prolonged air contest in World War II, as the remarkable surge in Axis aircraft production in 1944 was undermined by growing oil shortages and the increasing inferiority of novice replacement pilots. A key challenge for modern wargamers is how to incorporate this human dimension into their models, in the absence of the ongoing operational experience which kept Watu's games closely aligned with reality. Sporadic real-world data, such as that from the 1991 Gulf War, reveals relative attrition rates which may differ by an order of magnitude from those predicted purely on the basis of the comparative technical strengths of the opposing weapon systems. The hardest factor to model is the impact of morale and instincts of self-preservation. Computer games of modern combat routinely produce rapid mutual bloodbaths, since even with human players, war games contain the inescapable and welcome artificiality that the combatants are not risking their lives for real. The dissonance has become ever greater since the days of Watu, because at the same time as weaponry has become increasingly effective and theoretically lethal, the sensitivity of modern societies to casualties has become more acute, as family sizes have fallen and medical advances have made premature death the exception rather than the rule. Casualty bills, far lower than those in previous conflicts, have hence undermined the sustainability of intervention operations. And recently, societies have accepted crippling economic costs to try to minimize deaths from COVID, even though mortality among those not already old or infirm is vastly lower than from the notorious Spanish flu a century ago. In light of these contrary trends of increasing weapons lethality, but growing casualty sensitivity, uncertainties regarding what form a serious clash between major powers might actually take are greater now than ever before. The fifth and final key difference I see between the challenges faced by Watu and those which wargamers face today concerns the number of distinct actors whose perspectives and decisions need to be incorporated for the simulation to operate effectively. Watu had the luxury of operating in the context of an all-out zero-sum conflict between two opposed blocks, in which only the decisions of a handful of U-boat and escort commanders really mattered in shaping the tactical actions being modeled. Each of these actors could be represented by a human player. And although the famous screens used by Watu to create limited intelligence look quaintly primitive compared to the first-person real-time computer simulations of U-boat battles now available to every hobbyist, the essential effect was achieved. This situation stands in stark contrast to the huge number of actors whose perspectives and decisions need to be modeled in some way in a typical modern wargame. Even in a tactical game, such as a networked VBS computer game of a patrol in Afghanistan, every individual soldier is constantly facing portentous decisions over which roadside clutter might contain an IED, whether he or she can risk holding fire against inherently ambiguous or intermingled targets, and how to interact safely but beneficially with the local population. Any mistake might prove fatal to oneself or one's colleagues, or be escalated by enemy propaganda and pervasive smartphone video into a strategic furore, like that occasioned, of course, by the killing of George Floyd. Operational or strategic level wargames now take place in a complex multipolar environment in which different national contingents, local factions, NGOs, and reporters each have their own complex agendas, and success requires judicious negotiation and coalition building. In today's increasingly fragmented world, there are usually not enough wargame players even to have one per nation or faction. So differences have to be collapsed by creating artificially coherent blocks, or by consigning excess actors to the hands of the control team, which may use them in unrealistic ways to nudge the game onto a desired track. Representing an entire complex nation or faction by a single game decision maker with clear objectives is in any case a gross distortion of the reality of multiple groups and individuals struggling for power and influence, thereby creating confused, changeable and suboptimal net policy choices, as illustrated by the sorry saga of Brexit. So, I hope I've succeeded in showing that the deserved fame of Watu as a prime historical example of successful wargaming rested on a very particular set of circumstances, which modern wargamers find increasingly difficult to replicate. Let me close by suggesting why this matters and what the implications are for wargaming today. One important conclusion relates to this year's conference theme of Wargame AI. Some suggest we can supplement or even replace human players in wargames by increasingly capable AI software, thereby potentially allowing much easier iteration of games and the generation of statistical distributions of game outcomes of the kind currently only available with automatic simulations or simple abstract wargames like Signal. Were we still facing the same challenge faced by Watu, AI play would undoubtedly be an attractive option, since growing AI mastery not only of chess, but also of much more complex games like Go and StarCraft, suggests that iterative machine learning could quickly discover even more optimal ways of addressing the known and calculable technical threat which the U-boats posed. Growing incorporation of AI may also help to address the problem I just identified of the proliferation of relevant actors by providing ways of handling this massive decision makers without impractical expansion of human role-playing. As Secretary Work said yesterday, AI clearly does have increasing potential to contribute to wargames in appropriate areas. But before we extend the diversity and inclusion enjoined by the Derby House principles to welcome computers as wargame players on an equal basis to humans, thereby potentially blurring into insignificance the distinctions between wargaming, game theory, and OA, let me sound a note of caution based on the other differences I identified between Watu and wargaming today. AI is remorselessly rational in pursuing whatever objectives its program has set, hence the concern that autonomous weapons can never follow the famous 3 rules of robotics, which Asimov proposed, to guard against computers' utter lack of empathy, compassion, and common sense. The rationality of AI is an asset in developing optimal strategies in artificial games like StarCraft, where the entire game universe is neatly codified and all that matters is maximizing victory points. But the complex cocktail of calculation, passion, caution, and self-sacrifice, which shapes human decisions in real, mortal conflict, is almost impossible to capture in rational terms. Since, as I've shown, it's very hard to estimate in advance the crucial balance of risk-taking, restraint, and incompetence which will shape future conflict, having AI work out to the nth degree the theoretical outcome of an all-out duel between selected weapons like that tackled by Watu misses the key human source of uncertainty in the simulation. Although agent-based computer modeling can help to predict crowd behavior in disaster situations, for example, it's far from clear that it can reliably capture the wild swings seen recently in political developments around the world, as individual events and triggers, narrow voting victories, popular uprisings, and the mercurial choices of populist politicians are magnified in chaotic fashion by instant and pervasive media and social media coverage. AI is also ill-equipped to display the ingenuity needed to find novel tactics with which to wrong-foot opponents in today's real-world conflicts, as it did in the artificial game of Go. Not only would this require programming the entire almost infinite range of possible levers into the game, but it would also require identifying the often emotional and irrational factors which make some actions tolerable, while others, despite perhaps being less damaging, become irresistibly provocative. Since conflict is an intensely human phenomenon, human players with all their natural mental baggage are better placed to model realistic decisions in wargames than impersonal, inhuman AI will ever be. So if AI does not offer salvation, are the increased challenges facing wargamers today so great that wargaming no longer offers the cost-effective analytical insights it provided in the simpler days of Watu? I think not, as long as we use forms of wargames appropriate to the new situation. Although my own specialism lies in games with rigid rules and an entire self-contained game universe, these do not seem to me most appropriate for analyzing today's tangled, uncertain, and multidimensional conflict, even though this is the only kind of game which existing AI may be programmed to play. While I greatly applaud the ingenuity behind the project on nuclear gaming's fascinating and very worthwhile signal game of nuclear confrontation, I do worry that its focus on repeated iteration to provide the statistical results so idolized by US social scientists comes at the expense of a rigid and highly abstract game system, which inevitably makes many simplistic assumptions and adopts a rather blithe approach to this gravest of topics. Any individual wargame is irredeemably flawed as a model of today's complex and uncertain realities. Endless iteration may hence teach us more about the artificial game itself than about the real world which it purports to represent. In my view, we will gain at least as much insight from a continuing succession of different one-off wargames, with minimal rules and other artificial constraints, reacting quickly to unexpected events, shaped decisively by the judgments and decisions of the human participants. And this, of course, is precisely the kind of brainstorming wargame now reported frequently in the media, as played by senior decision makers as they struggle to plan for developing contingencies in the continuing COVID crisis. The trouble for professional wargamers like ourselves is that the more elaborate and ponderous Watu style of game, which we focused on designing hitherto, may not be as useful in today's very different and fast-changing strategic environment. However, there is clearly still a place for such games, be they manual or computerized, in exploring the theoretical potential for shooting wars within a given set of selected constraints, as long as we understand that human fear, fury, and incompetence would likely combine to make any real clash very different from the technically focused simulated version. It's vital for us to explore whether pressure to strike first to disable the entire enemy system, as Secretary Work described yesterday, creates an all-or-nothing dynamic, which deters more limited uses of force. And also, whether a lasting military advantage is achievable by such a strike without tipping both antagonists into an enduring and increasingly mutually damaging conflict, like that triggered in the past by Operation Barbarossa, Pearl Harbor, or North Korea's invasion of the South. As Martin van Creveld and others have suggested, it may even be that the virtual wars in which we now engage so frequently for recreation as well as professional study are our own way of vicariously satisfying our combative instincts and even seeking to overawe our adversaries without the costs and risks of fighting for real. The greatest strength of the wargaming community is its passionate and continuous search for new and better ways of modeling past and potential crises and conflicts. And this constant innovation and diversity will be our salvation, as long as we recognize that all individual approaches are flawed. None have a monopoly on insight or intellectual validity. The presentations at this conference offer a cornucopia of different ideas. They show that wargaming today is in rude health, despite facing challenges much more tangled and uncertain, though thankfully less grave and immediate, than were faced by our forebears in Watu. Long may the innovation continue. Thanks.
Outstanding, as always. Okay, we have time for questions. Moderator, take it away.
Hi, this is Merle Robinson. I'm helping moderate your questions today. We have a question from Dan Novak. Dr. Sabin, do you believe simulations have helped or muddied the waters in wargaming today?
I tend to use the term simulation and wargaming too interchangeably. Some say that they're entirely at different extremes. Simulation is clearly an element of wargaming. It was put very well yesterday by Graham Longley Brown and others that wargames require players of some form, I think humans, and they're operating within a simulation. It's very difficult to give a generic answer to that. Clearly, in some ways, wargames and simulations have been misleading in hindsight. In other ways, they've been incredibly prescient. We've had some reports of COVID games, for example, which took place in the months before the actual outbreak in global terms in March, which if people had paid attention, would have been so helpful. Yeah. So it's very difficult to give an overall answer, except to say that what we need is a self-critical and mutually critical, a constructively critical approach. We need people to come and say, yeah, this helps, but it's wrong in this way, I think, and therefore let's try a different way and let's see if we can get another angle on the subject. Yeah? As was said about models, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Even an unrealistic wargame or simulation can be incredibly useful because it gets people thinking about the flaws, and it gets people thinking, therefore, about the real world. So it's almost always worth playing as long as you play in a constructively critical way.
Okay, the next question is from Rex Bryden. I wonder if you could also comment on what Watu did right that's still applicable, such as multi-methods analysis, integration of tactical AARs, and intelligence management and institutional issues, etc.
As I said, I don't want to set myself up as a great expert in Watu because I'm not. But I do think it's, and I wasn't in any way saying it got things wrong. I was saying it worked for the time. Were we in that situation, I hope we would do something just as well as they did, and indeed incorporate computers and AI and so on to do it even better. But Watu pioneered these sorts of techniques that Rex mentions, and therefore laid the groundwork for the kind of wargaming that we're doing today. As I say, nothing but praise for Watu. I certainly don't want to criticize it, and I think it did almost everything right. Within the limits of the technology of the time, including, as I said, the gender balance.
So the next one's from Corey Phillips. Could AI be used to come up with scenarios that could probably be not predicted by humans, and then have the humans play out the war game and using those potential scenarios?
AI can generate enormous numbers of hypotheses, okay, very quickly. Whether we then have the ability, or whether AI has the ability to highlight which of them are worth looking at is another matter. My worry about AI in terms of trying to get novel ideas about the real world is you have to program the real world into Watu. It can come up with wonderful new ways of playing Go, because Go is an artificial game universe and the AI can learn everything about it, literally 100% everything about it. You need an AI like Commander Data to be able to look at the real world and use their tremendous processing power to be able to make something of that input, seems to me. So that's my essential problem with the limits of AI in this regard, that it's not going to have the ingenuity unless somebody programs the data, and it becomes a catch-22. Because if somebody's programming in the data and also saying, but humans are special because we really don't like being poisoned on the streets of Salisbury, for example, yeah, even though it might only be one person compared to thousands who die in other cases, then almost we've already done the thinking ourselves in order to program into AI. So I'd certainly never say never. One interesting way of wargaming, which is not entirely linked with AI, is the RAND approach, which essentially says, what's the full range of things that could happen? Not what's most likely or plausible, what's the full range? Because we are not able, clearly in hindsight, to judge whether something is plausible or not, because the things that we deem implausible often tend to occur, the Taylor point. But that takes, of course, a long, long time. Maybe AI can help us with that iteration, filling out all of the probability spaces. But then somebody's got to say, yeah, now we need to take account of this rather than just dismissing it because it's one of thousands of possible outcomes. And AI is very good potentially at, for example, sorting through an enormous photo data set and saying, have a look at this one, please. We really need AI to be able to do that for us rather than just proliferating potential areas to explore, which we then don't have the time to explore.
Okay, we have about 4 more minutes for questions. The next one's from Peter Perla. Any thoughts on how to induce senior decision makers to participate in games so they can experience the insights firsthand?
This was another reason why I said the kind of war games that we need today are the kind which are actually taking place. I had in mind one that was played by Boris Johnson and his team with regard to COVID. And that was just to us a bog sack. It was people with a few flip charts on different corners of the room, looking through what might happen if there's an outbreak in London again, etc. You see, so you have to start from where people are at, and people are senior decision makers are not coming and taking part in the kind of war games that we actually put together on a professional basis with rules and hexes and all of that. They are much more able to take part and understand seminar-style wargaming. So I think that's another reason why those may well be at least as appropriate as other forms for today. And how to get people's attention. You get people's attention when they have a problem that they need to solve today, and you come up and you say, here's the solution to it. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult. And COVID is the COVID, repressive COVID war games, and they're not being taken sufficiently seriously in advance, is a perfect illustration. Same thing happened before 9/11. In hindsight, it was perfectly conceivable that 9/11 would happen somehow. They'd even tried it a couple of years earlier. But nobody really takes any notice until it happens, sadly.
Okay, our next question is from Scott Bukoff. Given the discussion on AI, what do you think wargaming will look like in 20 years?
Different from anything that we hypothesize, certainly in terms of specific ideas. And one of the best ways of working out what might happen in the future is to look, or our limits of looking at that, is to look back at the past. Who would have thought 20 years ago, for example, that we'd still be playing board games? Indeed, that board games would be having such a resurgence in professional and also in recreational terms, you see. So following simple trends like AI is getting more and more powerful, therefore everything is going to be dominated by AI, are limited by the many, many contrary factors, S-curves and so on, which mean that it's not that simple. All I do hope is that wargaming will be flourishing as it is today, and that we'll be making use of the even more capable technology and so on to help us to tackle probably even more tangled and complex problems.
I'm sorry to say this is probably our last question. This is from Evan D'Alessandro. Do you think there's any place for AI in war games and decision-making capabilities, presenting an opponent 90 degrees to a normal person, or would you view that as counterproductive?
I don't think anything is counterproductive. I think we need to use the ingenuity that I talked about to incorporate AI wherever possible in ways that help us. Okay. And we'll experiment, and in some cases it won't seem to work. What I don't like, the thing that I warn up against most is the idea that there's one way of doing things. There was a computer program, I forget the name, which for a while everybody was putting their hopes in. Oh, it's so powerful, it can model the entire world, everything. All of these old games that we used to do, they're now old hat. Now all we need is to program this massive computer intelligence, artificial intelligence, and it will tell us what to do. No. That way disaster lies. But anything short of that in terms of, if you have an idea, try it out, please.
Checking the schedule, we have time for just a couple more. Peter Perla had one I thought was very intriguing. What is your opinion about the notion that only someone from a particular culture can effectively represent that culture in a game?
No, I don't think that. And I think there's a danger with that sort of typecasting. One was said yesterday, you're highlighting just one attribute, either nationality, rather than all the other factors, age, gender, etc. But also, the more that you, let's say, recruit a Russian to play a Russian, the more that they may feel, well, I now have to follow, the official propaganda line rather than doing what I think is realistic because, it's my duty to my nation, whatever. So what I do think you need to do is whoever plays that particular actor to study the real motivations, the real concerns, the real constraints, and so on. And you're not going to get it right, but I don't think necessarily typecasting someone from that culture to play it is the best way. However, of course, there is great advantage in not having all males or all Americans or Anglo-Americans playing the entire world just because we're here and convenient. Because the ideas of someone coming in, which may well be, how dare you run a war game which demonizes my culture in this way. We need those perspectives, but not necessarily typecasting and having people only play their own counterpart.
So the next question is from Gary Parker. Do you foresee a battle royale between wargaming and the so-called super forecasting as conducted by Professor Philip Tetlock?
Perhaps good, frankly. What will help us is if everybody is looking at other people's ideas and suggestions and saying, yeah, this helps in this, but it's wrong in this. And then there's a good fight. As long as we're civilized and constructive, that actually gets us to a better place than either one of them dominating. There's clearly, built in going to be competition. There's competition for resources. The proliferation of war gamers, in inverted commas, in the United States, given the pot of money that Secretary Work was talking about yesterday, has been quite astonishing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But as I say, I hate to cite Mao in this, let 1,000 flowers bloom, because he was the last person to let anything survive. But the idea is there, better a diversity of constructively critical, mutually constructively critical approaches than any one struggling for dominance.
Okay, the next one is an anonymous question. Will a COVID-inspired shift towards online wargaming risk making these games more susceptible to data analysis machine learning? By playing traditional war games online through software platforms, do we risk even the rules light one-off games becoming more like simulations we want to avoid?
I think the move to online is very welcome. I mean, imagine we didn't have the internet. It's purely coincidence that COVID has come along at a time when we can have a conference like this. Imagine that it didn't exist, days of Spanish flu or even just 20 years ago. So it's an unmitigated advantage, it seems to me. We do need to recognize that there are ways in which wargaming virtually limits us. Just one simple one. It's far better to have a board in front of you and to look into the eyes of the people that you're playing, and therefore to be able to see in great detail what's going on at one point, but also have the big picture, you see. Far better than anything that all except the most high-resolution costly computer display could actually provide. There's many ways in which computers are a limit. They do, as the questioner suggests, provide some advantages, particularly in terms of recording and so on. But again, I refer the honourable gentleman to my previous answer. As long as we do, wherever possible, the different forms, including board gaming, face-to-face gaming and so on, as safety permits, as well as exploiting the new technology. And as long as we recognize the limits of everything, and that everything we do is flawed. Anybody who thinks that they've got the answer to everything, they're wrong, including me.
Okay, this one's from Byron Mushrush. Multiple views and participants are important to get a diversity of thoughts and creativity. But when do the number of participants get too big that it's counterproductive? How do you best create an optimal experience?
Horses for courses. Many war games, of course, have very large numbers of players, particularly those mega games or those that are run in staff college type environments. And if properly run, they can take advantage of that to get these different perspectives, the media and different factions and so on. But they're enormously difficult, inordinately difficult to try to coordinate and to get meaningful results from. Remember what Wellington said about the Battle of Waterloo. It's like a ball. Trying to write the history of the battle is like trying to write the history of the ball. Everybody has their own histories, and whom do you privilege, do you see? So there is still quite a lot of mileage in having just even two players, or one sometimes, playing, and thereby being able to encapsulate down to the fundamentals at least one aspect of the problem. So I don't think there's any ideal balance. And that should dominate over anything else. Use what works and use a mix of approaches for the same problem. And like with the shadows in Plato's cave, you might actually get something close to the reality, even though the only way we'll know about reality for real is when it's too late and it's actually happening.
Well, I'm sorry to say we're finally out of time, and we have lots more questions that people would love to ask. But thank you so much for your presentation. It's always fascinating and intriguing to listen to the thoughts you come up with.
Yeah, and Merle, thank you so much for being